Huge billionaire finds surrogate, is a virgin, and makes a life-changing decision. Hi, my beautiful family. How was your day today? Whether it's been long, stressful, or just a little heavy, I'm here to bring you a story that might ease your heart and lighten your evening. So sit back, take a deep breath, and let's dive into a journey where love, sacrifice, and unexpected choices change everything. Afternoon. Sunlight filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the CEO's office at Coltech Innovations, San Francisco's leading tech company. The space was sleek and minimalist, yet undeniably expensive. A blackwood desk, Italian leather chairs, and a modern abstract painting worth six figures hanging on the wall. Everything in the room spoke of power and control. But the man sitting at the center of it all, Ethan Cole, was a storm no one could see. At 39, Ethan had achieved everything society celebrated: vast wealth, industry-changing patents, and a billion-dollar company bearing his name. But there was one thing all that money couldn't buy: a family. Not a curated magazine cover with matching outfits and staged smiles, but the real thing: a child, a legacy, a piece of himself carried forward. 3 relationships had ended in failure. The women he dated seemed to fall in love with Ethan Cole, the brand, more than the man behind it. For a long time, he believed his career could fill the emptiness. But that illusion shattered the moment he woke up alone in his penthouse, surrounded by silence. No laughter, no warmth, no life. His mother, Margaret Cole, was the only one who still pushed him to solve the legacy issue. A retired state judge of California, she was a woman of logic, discipline, and cold pragmatism. Recently, she'd presented him with a very practical solution: gestational surrogacy. And today, Ethan was scheduled to meet the carefully vetted candidate for the role. Everything had been arranged like a strategic investment. What Ethan didn't know was that the woman about to walk into his office would change everything. The door opened quietly, and she stepped inside with hesitation, but not without dignity. Alyssa Moore, 25 years old, stood at an average height with rich white skin and a cascade of coiled hair pulled neatly back. Her lavender blazer hung slightly too loose on her frame, the sleeves brushing past her wrists, clearly second-hand or borrowed. Still, she entered the room as if walking into a foreign world, determined not to be swallowed by it. Ethan looked up, and for the first few seconds, he couldn't speak. She was unlike anyone he'd ever encountered in negotiations or high society galas. She wasn't trying to impress. No bold red lipstick, no designer bags, no calculating gaze. Just quiet resolve, weariness in her eyes, and a will to endure. Margaret rose with the poise of someone who had presided over 1,000 courtrooms. "Thank you for being punctual, Miss Moore. Please, have a seat." Alyssa nodded slightly and sat on the luxurious leather chair as though it were made of gold. Her hands clasped tightly in her lap, trembling faintly. But her spine remained straight, her chin lifted. Ethan noticed. She was afraid, but she wasn't letting fear define her. "Miss Moore," Ethan spoke for the first time, his voice deep and composed. "Thank you for agreeing to meet today. I trust the agency explained all the terms?" "Yes, Mr. Cole." Her voice was soft but steady. Their eyes met. And in that instant, Ethan saw something he hadn't encountered in years. Truth, not flattery, not hidden ambition, but something far more rare. Desperation, laced with dignity. A woman trying to hold herself together while the world demanded she fall apart. When their hands touched in a brief, polite shake, Ethan noticed the roughness of her skin, not from age, but from labor. These were the hands of someone who'd washed dishes, scrubbed floors, and counted loose change to get by. These were the hands of a woman who had fought to survive. He didn't know why his chest tightened the way it did. But deep inside, something shifted. For the first time in a long while, something moved in him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this woman was unlike anyone else he'd ever met. In the stillness of the room, the only sound was the quiet ticking of the wall clock. Margaret Cole opened the leather portfolio in front of her, revealing a thick stack of legal documents printed with names and terms, ready for signatures. "Before we move forward," she said calmly, "I want to confirm that you've reviewed the terms. The compensation is $500,000, plus full coverage of medical, housing, and living expenses throughout the pregnancy. Do you have any questions about that?" Alyssa shook her head gently. "No, ma'am. Everything was explained very clearly." Ethan hadn't taken his eyes off her. There was something in the way she answered, not once glancing at the amount, not the slightest flicker of greed, that made him pause. She was nothing like the others who had ever sat across from him for money. "Miss Moore," he said, his voice quieter now, more personal. "I realize this may be a private question, but I'd like to understand. Why did you agree to this? Surrogacy isn't something most young women consider, unless there's a powerful reason." For the first time, a crack formed in Alyssa's composure. She looked down, fingers tightening together until her knuckles turned pale. Ethan could see her fighting an inner war, whether to hold it in or let it out. Then she took a breath, lifted her eyes, and met his gaze head-on. "My mom," she said, her voice low and rough. "She has stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors said there's an experimental treatment that might extend her life, but the insurance won't cover it." Ethan froze. All the cold professionalism, all the clinical terminology and contracts suddenly felt absurd. "They need to start the treatment within 2 weeks," she continued. "If we don't make the first payment in time, her spot goes to someone else." She paused. "That first payment is $50,000. The honesty in her voice hit Ethan like a punch to the chest. No dreams of luxury, no ambitions of a new life, just saving her mother. "She's all I have," Alyssa said, her voice trembling now. "She raised me alone, worked 2 jobs for 15 years just to keep us afloat. I can't lose her just because I can't afford to save her." Margaret spun the silver pen in her fingers, avoiding her son's gaze. She wasn't used to emotions muddying negotiations. But Ethan couldn't look away from Alyssa. She wasn't crying. She wasn't begging. She was just telling the truth. And in that truth, he saw something no contract had ever offered him before: unconditional love. Ethan turned toward the floor-to-ceiling window, where the afternoon light spilled golden streaks across the marble floor. The entire city of San Francisco stretched below him. Towering buildings, crowded streets, lives unfolding in every direction. But none of it mattered compared to the image now etched into his mind. Alyssa, sitting upright across from him, eyes fierce yet desperate, willing to sacrifice everything to save her dying mother. He had signed hundreds of contracts, negotiated multi-million-dollar mergers, and recruited some of the sharpest minds in the world. But never once had he faced a choice that touched the humanity of another so deeply. Alyssa wasn't like the women who had once gravitated toward his wealth, his name, or his influence. She didn't beg. She didn't plead for sympathy. All she wanted was a chance at survival for the only family she had left. A tightness formed in his throat. A shame he hadn't felt in years crept into the edges of his thoughts. Had he really become the kind of man who used money to purchase someone else's sacrifice? His heart thudded heavily in his chest as he looked back at Alyssa. And for the first time, Ethan Cole, the man who believed every problem could be solved with numbers and strategy, began to question who he had become. Margaret turned to the final page of the medical file, scanning each line like a judge reviewing evidence before a verdict. "Your health records are excellent," she said, eyes still fixed on the paper. "No history of substance abuse, no hereditary risk factors, and your psychological evaluation was favorable. The clinic's doctors were impressed with your emotional stability. Alyssa nodded politely. I went through a full screening. The agency was very thorough. Ethan laced his fingers together, watching her with a feeling he hadn't yet identified. "May I ask something?" he said, his tone slower now. "I realize this might be personal, but have you ever been pregnant before?" Alyssa lifted her gaze and shook her head. "No, I haven't." Ethan hesitated. Something about her file had struck him earlier, an odd detail he hadn't been able to shake. "And have you ever seen a specialist about your ability to conceive?" Color rose to Alyssa's cheeks, but she answered plainly. "Yes, the agency required a complete fertility workup. Everything came back normal." Margaret was flipping back through the pages, her brow suddenly furrowing. She stopped. "Ah, here it is." She paused, then looked at her son. "This is unusual." "What is it?" Ethan asked. Margaret read aloud from the physician's notes. "Patient has never been sexually active." The words dropped into the room like a cold gust of wind. Ethan turned sharply toward Alyssa. Her face flushed deeper, but her eyes didn't waver. She nodded calmly. "That's correct." There was no shame in her voice, no discomfort, just a truth, plain and unmoving, like the sky is blue or the ocean is salt. Because I was focused on school, work, and taking care of my mom," she said. "I never met anyone I felt was worthy of." That, Ethan echoed, caught in the weight of her phrasing. "My virginity." She paused. "I never thought I'd give it up this way, but if that's what it takes to save her, I'll do it." A chill passed down Ethan's spine. This wasn't a contract anymore. It wasn't about medicine or logistics. This was a young woman offering the most intimate, untouched part of herself to a clinical, impersonal medical procedure, just to give her mother a chance at life. He felt sick, not because of her, but because of himself. Because for a moment he had treated this like a reasonable agreement. And now, Ethan knew, if he moved forward, he wouldn't just be a wealthy man. He would become a man who preyed on someone else's desperation. He felt a heaviness in his chest, part emotion, part shame. In his eyes now, Alyssa was no longer a solution to his longing for a child. She was a living embodiment of courage. And if he moved forward with this, he would become the kind of man who crushed that courage for personal gain. The room grew silent after Alyssa stepped out. Ethan remained still, his hands clenched at his sides, eyes lingering on the door she had just closed. He had never felt this unsure, not because of the contract, but because of the woman who had just sat across from him, and what she was willing to give up. Margaret began organizing the papers again, her voice composed and clinical, just as it had been throughout her years in court. "What are you hesitating for? All terms are clear. She qualifies, she's motivated, and she understands the arrangement. This is a legal transaction." Ethan exhaled, his gaze drifting toward the San Francisco sky, now streaked with burnt orange. A part of him wanted to nod, sign everything, move forward with the child he dreamed of. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw Alyssa, her calm but exhausted expression, trembling hands, and that unwavering voice saying, "I've never met anyone worthy of that gift." He turned back, his voice low and heavy. "I can't do this, Mom." Margaret looked up, her expression hardening. "Can't? Why not?" Ethan walked to the desk, pulling out his wallet and reaching for the rarely touched checkbook hidden in its inner pocket. Slowly, he began writing. Each digit weighed more than the last. "Because this stopped being a business decision the moment I understood what she's sacrificing. If I go through with it, I'm not building a family. I'm destroying hers." He tore the check from the pad, folded it gently, and laid it on the desk. $200,000, not in exchange for anything. It's a gift. No conditions, no agreements, no strings. Margaret didn't speak. For the first time during their entire conversation, she offered no rebuttal. She just stared at her son, not with disapproval, but with something that looked a lot like respect. Ethan left the room without another word. Alyssa sat in the hallway, her hands tightly clasped in her lap. When she saw Ethan approaching, she stood immediately, worry flashing in her eyes. "Did I do something wrong?" Ethan shook his head gently, offering a faint smile, the first that didn't feel weighted or forced. "No, Alyssa," he said, using her name with a tone full of quiet reverence. "You did everything right." He held out the check. She glanced at it, then back up, confused. "What is this?" "A gift for your mother's treatment." Alyssa took a step back, shaking her head. "But I haven't done anything. I didn't sign. I didn't—" "You don't have to," Ethan interrupted softly. "I don't want you to give up part of yourself to get help. You've already given more than enough." Her hands trembled as she accepted the check. "Why would you do this for me? I haven't done anything." "You can, and you should," Ethan said, meeting her gaze. "Because this isn't a negotiation. It's the first thing I've ever done. Not to gain something, but simply to give." Alyssa began to cry, quiet, uncontrollable tears that spilled down her cheeks, not from pain, but from relief, from disbelief that this was real. Ethan stood still, letting her have the moment. And as he watched her wipe her tears away, there was only one feeling in his chest. For the first time in his life, Ethan Cole hadn't taken anything. He had truly given. 1 week later, when Ethan asked to meet Alyssa again, she assumed it would be about unfinished contracts. But what awaited her wasn't a proposal, but a purpose. This time, it was at Coltech's new charity office, tucked into a modest building near the edge of the bay. There were no sharp suits or 12-foot conference tables, just warm lighting, mission posters on the walls, and files of families waiting for help. Ethan had invited Alyssa not to revisit old contracts, but to offer her something real, a full-time position at the new philanthropic foundation he was building, focused on helping low-income patients access critical treatment. "You inspired me," he told her. "I want to take what you did, your courage, your sacrifice, and turn it into a model that helps hundreds more." Alyssa was speechless. She never imagined that after everything, she'd be sitting here, not as someone in need, but as someone who could make a difference. She said yes. In the weeks that followed, they worked side by side. Ethan, the man once obsessed with metrics and margins, began learning how to truly listen to human stories. Alyssa, the quiet girl who had spent most of her life in survival mode, began to show her strength through every project they touched. She didn't speak much, but whenever she shared a family's case, her voice carried something that stirred something deep in him. Not pity, but real empathy. Ethan found himself spending more and more time at the foundation, less in boardrooms, not out of obligation, but because he wanted to be near her. One late evening, as they were reviewing the final case file of the day, Alyssa looked up from her notes and stared at him. "Why did you choose me?" she asked softly. Ethan didn't answer right away. He set his pen down and met her gaze, something tender in his voice. "Because you're unlike anyone I've ever met," he said slowly. "Because you made me want to do the right thing, not out of duty, but from something deeper." In the quiet glow of the office, in that simple exchange, they both knew the connection between them had shifted. They were no longer donor and recipient, no longer boss and employee. They were two souls learning how to truly see one another. In the early days of working together, there was still an invisible distance between Ethan and Alyssa. He was a CEO used to overseeing multi-million-dollar ventures. She was a young woman who once waited tables, knocking on charity doors just to win back a sliver of hope for her mother. They came from entirely different worlds, but it was that very difference that made them start to see each other differently. Ethan respected Alyssa for her calm determination and quiet dedication. She never complained, never sought attention. She listened to every case, remembered every detail, and fought for each patient as if they were her own family. Once, a case was denied due to a missing document. Instead of letting it go, Alyssa made calls to every hospital and doctor involved. When Ethan asked her why, she simply said, "They've been turned down too many times. I don't want to be another person who gives up on them." He didn't know what to say, and Alyssa, over time, realized Ethan wasn't just the man behind the checkbook. He was truly changing. The cold demeanor from their first meeting was gone. He asked for her opinions, listened to her suggestions, and wasn't afraid to admit when he was wrong. Once, Ethan forgot to approve an urgent funding request. When he realized the mistake, he called Alyssa late at night, not to make excuses, but to apologize. Not as a boss to an employee, but as one person apologizing to someone he genuinely respected. That's when she knew. Ethan didn't see her as the woman who almost signed a contract. He saw her as a partner. That quiet respect became their foundation. They didn't rush, didn't label their feelings, but their glances lingered a little longer each day. Their check-in questions grew more thoughtful, and their lunchtime smiles, a little more honest every time. They didn't need to define what was happening, because they both understood. When a relationship begins with respect, it has the power to grow into something lasting. The days working side by side slowly dissolved the space between them, replacing it with something unspoken, something neither of them dared name, but both could feel in every glance, every quiet gesture. And though the words hadn't been said, they both knew. It was time for Ethan to meet the most important person in Alyssa's life. The very woman whose love had changed him in ways he never expected. One afternoon, as the sun outside the window began to dip into gold, Alyssa looked up from a case file and asked hesitantly, "Would you like to meet my mom?" Ethan didn't answer right away, but the quiet nod that followed said everything. That late afternoon, the hospital corridor was quiet. Only the soft hum of medical carts and yellow light reflecting off cold tile floors. Ethan walked slowly behind Alyssa, holding a bouquet of white chrysanthemums, the kind she said her mother loved most. "Room 312, Alyssa said softly. "But I didn't tell her you were coming." Ethan nodded. "I understand. If she doesn't want to speak, I'll leave." Alyssa studied him for a moment, then gently opened the door. Lena sat upright in bed, her head wrapped in a scarf, her complexion pale, but her eyes sharp as they landed on the unfamiliar man entering. Illness had drained her, but the strength of a mother protecting her daughter remained unmistakable. "Mom," Alyssa stepped closer. "I brought someone with me today." "Someone?" Lena's eyes narrowed as she scanned Ethan. Immaculate suit, calm demeanor. Clearly not just anyone. "Who is he?" "My name is Ethan Morgan, ma'am," he said, stepping forward but stopping at a respectful distance. "I work with Alyssa, and I'd like a moment to speak with you, if you're willing." Lena looked at her daughter, brows furrowed. Alyssa gave a slight nod and a gentle smile. With a small sigh, Lena gestured to the chair. "All right, sit." Ethan pulled the chair closer, still holding the bouquet. "Before I say anything, I want to be honest," he began, his voice low and steady. "I first approached Alyssa not to offer a job, but to make a proposal, something I'm not proud of now." Lena's grip tightened on the blanket. "I asked her to be a surrogate," Ethan continued without flinching. "It was a selfish decision, born from pressure, legacy, and arrogance. But when I heard why she agreed, because of you, I couldn't go through with it." Silence settled over the room. Lena's gaze fixed on Ethan, cutting through the surface of his words, looking for the truth underneath. "You think money can fix everything?" she asked, voice faint but firm. "Maybe I used to," Ethan admitted. "But that day, when she told me about your illness, about the sacrifices you've made for her, I realized I'd never truly given anything that mattered. For the first time, I wanted to do the right thing, not for gain, not for image, but because someone deserved help." Lena remained silent for a long moment. Then she turned to Alyssa, who stood quietly nearby, her expression anxious. "Do you trust him?" she asked gently. "I do," Alyssa replied without hesitation. Lena looked back at Ethan. The tiredness in her eyes softened into something warmer. "You know," she said slowly, "I've met many wealthy people. Few of them are brave enough to own their mistakes. You might be one of the rare ones." Ethan exhaled, deeply moved, not by victory, but by acceptance. "Thank you for giving me this chance," he said sincerely. "What do you want from my daughter?" Lena asked bluntly. Ethan turned to Alyssa. "I want to stand beside her, not to rescue, but to walk with her, if you'll allow it." Lena smiled, a real smile, for the first time in months. "Then prove it, not with words, with how you treat her every day." Ethan nodded. "I promise." Her eyes softened, as if in that moment she no longer saw a cold businessman, but a man learning how to love. "I don't trust easily, especially when it comes to Alyssa," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "She's given up too much already, but I saw the way you looked at her, and I saw that she trusts you." Ethan bowed his head, humbled. Lena gave a quiet nod. "If my daughter chooses to trust you, then I'll give you a chance too. Just don't break that trust, Ethan." In that moment, Ethan realized he'd just been given something more valuable than any deal he'd ever closed: trust. That afternoon, the sky over New York was painted in soft gray, as if the city itself was holding its breath for what was about to be said. Alyssa and Ethan stepped out of the hospital lobby, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of nearby flowers from the park. They walked side by side for a while, saying nothing. It didn't feel awkward. Their silence now held understanding. Finally, Ethan stopped and turned to her. "Alyssa?" She looked at him. "Yes?" "I don't know how to do this," he began. His eyes, once guarded, were now unsure, like a boy learning what love feels like for the first time. "I've never felt this before." She waited, eyes steady. "For the first time in my life, I care about someone with no conditions attached. No money, no appearance, no background, just you." Alyssa said nothing. His words filled the air like a quiet heartbeat. "I walked into that meeting thinking you were a contract, but you turned out to be my compass." She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "And I know it sounds crazy," he added. "We barely know each other, but I don't want to step back. I want to give this a real chance." Alyssa looked into his eyes. "Are you sure?" "More sure than I've ever been," Ethan replied. Silence returned, but this time she broke it. She stepped closer, facing him directly. "Then you should know something." "What?" "I'm scared too," she whispered. "Scared that all of this will disappear like a dream." He gently lifted her chin with his fingertips. "Then let me be the one to prove otherwise." Their first kiss didn't rush in. It arrived like a promise, like acceptance, like a door slowly opening. Soft, hesitant, and filled with depth, as if they were stepping into a world where there was no pity, no contract, just two people willing to believe in something good. When they pulled apart, Alyssa exhaled softly, and Ethan smiled for the first time that day. "We're starting something, aren't we?" she asked. He took her hand. "Not starting. It started long ago. Today, we finally admitted it." From that moment on, everything between them began to change. No more reserved conversations, no more careful distance. Instead, there was natural coordination, gentle care, and eyes that always found each other in the crowd. Love made them stronger, not only for each other, but also for the people who needed them out there. And from that love, an idea gradually formed. It came one crisp autumn morning as Ethan and Alyssa sat in the office, reviewing medical aid applications from struggling families. Faces of children awaiting surgeries, single mothers desperate for their child's medication, each story stirred something deep within them. "I used to think," Alyssa whispered, fingers gently flipping through a file, "if I hadn't walked into your office that day, my mom might not be alive today." Ethan looked at her, his expression solemn. "I used to think if you hadn't told me the truth, I'd still be a man who tried to buy everything, even life." They sat in silence for a while. Then, as if guided by the same thought, Alyssa looked up, her eyes glowing. "What if we could help people like I once was?" "Not just one or two," Ethan added. "Hundreds, thousands, a treatment fund named after your mom." Alyssa blinked back tears. "Lena Grace Foundation." Weeks later, the foundation opened its doors as winter crept into New York. Alyssa took the role of executive director. Ethan became the lead donor and co-founder. Every application was read with care. Every story heard with compassion, not from pity, but from a place of memory. Alyssa knew what it felt like to stand in a hospital with nothing. Ethan understood the strength of a woman who would sacrifice everything for someone she loved. Lena, now recovered, became a counselor for patients and their families. The illness that once brought her to the brink of death now lit a path for others. 1 year in, the foundation had helped over 80 families secure critical medical treatment. But more importantly, it helped Ethan and Alyssa realize they weren't just in love. They were building something bigger than love itself, a legacy. Working together at the Lena Grace Foundation, Ethan and Alyssa developed a bond that went far beyond any traditional partnership. Not just co-founders, they became teammates, confidants who listened, understood, and stood beside each other through every hard decision. There were days when Alyssa was drained by stories too close to her own past, families with nothing, desperate for help. And Ethan, once obsessed with profit, now sat beside her, reading each file in silence before saying, "We can't save the whole world, but today we can save one family." Ethan had changed. He was no longer the cold man who measured people in terms of contracts and conditions. He started visiting small clinics, listening to nurses share about patients, asking questions only someone who truly cared would ask. He no longer looked at people with calculation, but with compassion. For Alyssa, what moved her the most wasn't how much money Ethan gave the foundation. It was how deeply he listened, how he no longer saw helping as charity, but as sharing. She didn't just love him, she respected him, and that respect became the foundation of a lasting love. One late afternoon, as the office lights cast a soft amber glow against the building's glass windows, Ethan stood by the window, holding a small velvet box he had kept tucked away in his desk drawer for weeks. Alyssa walked in, unwrapping her scarf, surprised to see him still there. "You're still here?" Ethan turned around, a faint smile on his lips, but determination in his eyes. "There's something important I need to tell you." She walked closer, folding the file in her hands and placing it on the table. "What is it?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he opened the velvet box, a simple, elegant ring with a single round diamond, not flashy, but warm and sincere. "I used to think I needed an heir, someone to carry on the legacy, the name," Ethan said, his voice low but steady. "But since meeting you, I realized what I truly need is a partner, someone to wake up with every morning, to share faith, fears, and hope." Alyssa remained silent, her lips slightly parted as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "I don't just love you, Alyssa," he continued. "I admire you. I respect you. You never had to prove you deserved love, because you're the reason I want to become someone who does deserve it." She raised her hand to her lips, tears silently falling. "Will you marry me?" In that moment, time stood still, not because of the ring or the romantic words, but because of the look in his eyes, so sincere it made her heart tremble. Alyssa nodded without hesitation. "Yes, I will." Ethan exhaled, relieved, and pulled her into his arms. In that moment, the outside world disappeared. There was only the two of them, two people who had walked through pain, faced fear, and found each other in the most unexpected place, in trust and in love. That spring morning, the small garden behind Lena's house bloomed under gentle sunlight. White flowers lined the path in delicate simplicity, wooden chairs arranged neatly beneath blossoming almond trees. There were no crowds, no extravagant gowns, only the people who truly mattered. Ethan stood quietly at the altar, adjusting the button on his crisp white shirt, eyes fixed on the stone path where Alyssa had just appeared. She wore a soft white dress, no lace, no sparkle, just as simple and honest as she was. To him, she was everything. Lena sat in the front row, healthy and radiant, her face glowing as though she had never spent a day in a hospital. As Alyssa passed by, she reached for her daughter's hand, whispering, "I'm so proud of you." When it was time for vows, Ethan held Alyssa's hands. His voice was thick with emotion. "You didn't just change how I see the world. You made me want to live differently, live better. Before you, I lived to achieve. Now I live to give. You are the kindest thing that's ever happened to me." Alyssa smiled through tears, then spoke. "I used to think I wasn't whole enough to be loved, but you saw me, really saw me, and because of you, I no longer feel like someone needing rescue, but someone worthy of love." They embraced after their vows. There was no music, no fireworks, just the sound of wind and two hearts beating in quiet harmony. It wasn't a fairy tale wedding. It was a wedding between two people who had once been broken, but found healing in each other's truth. 1 month after the wedding, their new kitchen bathed in sunlight. Lena was making tea, her face glowing with health. So much so that sometimes Alyssa still couldn't believe this was the same woman who once lay unconscious in a hospital bed. Ethan was arranging flowers in a glass vase at the center of the table. No longer the polished CEO, but a man learning how to live slowly, live fully. Alyssa walked in, holding a small piece of paper, this morning's medical results. Her hands trembled, eyes already welling with tears. He looked at her, concerned. "Is everything okay?" Alyssa nodded. She couldn't speak. She simply stepped forward, placed the paper on the table, and took his hand in hers. Ethan leaned down to read. His eyes moved over each line until they reached the last. He looked up, his mouth parting in disbelief. Ethan's brow furrowed. "Wait, are you saying—" She nodded, biting her lip, eyes welling. "Yes, twins." She laughed through tears. "2 babies." He said nothing at first. Then he laughed, a real laugh, wide and overwhelmed. He wrapped her in his arms, spinning her around the kitchen. Lena walked out from the back and saw them. She didn't ask anything. She just set her tea down and began to cry, from joy. 3 people, once broken pieces, now stood together in the same kitchen in the soft morning light, with a future growing quietly inside Alyssa's heart and her womb. They didn't know what the road ahead would bring. But for the first time, they weren't afraid, because now they had each other, and something more powerful than love, a family.